Our next speaker is Dr. Ricard Cervera. He is a senior consultant and head of the Department of Autoimmune Diseases, Hospital Clínico Barcelona, Director of Research Group in Systemic Autoimmune Diseases at the Instituto de Investigaciones Biomédicas Augusto Pi Sunyer of Barcelona, and professor of the Department of Medicine and coordinator of the Master on Autoimmune Diseases at the Universidad de Barcelona, Barcelona, Catalonia, España. Also, he is coordinator of the European Forum on Antiphospholipid Antibodies and of the European Working Party on Systemic Lupus Erythematosus. Dr. Cervera is also chairman of the Medical Advisory Board of the Catalan Association of Lupus Patients and medical advisor to Lupus Europe. Dr. Cervera.
Thank you very much for your kind presentation, and I wanted to use the opportunity that I have now just to say thank you and congratulations to the organizers of this marvelous Congress. I see here one of the chairmen, Bernardo. Muchísimas felicidades. This is really, I think, the best Lupus Congress so far. And I have to tell you, and this is in connection with this presentation, that I am really very proud to see the success of this meeting. I am going to talk now on networking in Europe on lupus, which I think that the concept of networking is really essential. And being probably pioneers in the concept of networking in Europe, we were approached just maybe a few years after we created this EuroLupus group by some Latin American people. I think it was 2 or 3 people from Argentina and from Mexico who came to me and asked, well, what is probably the reason of the success, and give us probably some advice for us, for Latin American people. And well, I think I said something, probably start with simple things, start with doing epidemiological studies, start being friends, which is probably the main thing to have a success. But what I can say is that you have done an enormous work during these years. It's marvelous what Luis has just presented. I think that probably even you have done more things that we have done in Europe. And I am sure that from now on, probably you will do even many more things. So my most sincere congratulations for the work that you have done with GLADEL. You know that in 3 years' time, the Lupus Congress will go back to Europe. The organizer, Professor Smolin, is one of the core members of the EuroLupus group since the beginning. We will try probably to do in Europe at least something similar to the great success that you have done here. So really, my most sincere congratulations, Bernardo and Mari Carmen and Eloisa and all the team that organized this Congress. I am going to talk, as I mentioned you before, probably more on the concept of networking than just on specific results, epidemiological results, although you will see some figure during this presentation. This is the work that we have done in Europe in this network, which we call the European Working Party on Systemic Lupus Erythematosus, but in short, we call EuroLupus Group, and everybody knows us nowadays as the EuroLupus Group. But this group, this concept, started in 1990 by just joining 2 ideas that we have on one side in Barcelona and in another side in London. For people, unfortunately, one of them is not anymore with us, and I just want to remind his name, Professor Font, who unfortunately died 6 years ago, were the persons who had the idea to join the efforts of these groups in London and in Barcelona, and to open this to many other centers in Europe in order to create a network of European centers devoted to research on lupus, to organize multi-center studies, not just until that moment, probably we did studies between 2 centers, 3 centers maybe, but we needed studies with 20, 30 centers altogether. And the first thing was to create a network in order to gather all these centers and to facilitate the interchange of information by means of scientific workshops. It's also important to make just workshops working workshops, not just big congresses that certainly existed before, but just working workshops. And, well, so far we have started and we are working on many projects. Some of them, the first projects were epidemiological projects, the simple studies, probably just to gather data into a computer and without needing blood samples, without giving any drug that requires much more complexity. And this is the way to start in an easy way, the best way to have a success. And then we started the now famous EuroLupus project, collecting 1,000 patients from all over Europe. But then we were able to start also sending blood samples from one center to another. We did an immunogenetic study. And then we did the big forward step, which was to make trials, therapeutic trials, investigator-initiated trials, which was at that time, it was really very rare. Even now, it's even very rare and very difficult. Probably it's now even more difficult than before. And we did, which now is famous, just in the previous session, you have seen the EuroLupus nephritis trial that now is one of the standard of care in lupus management. But we are still doing many other studies. There are more than 20 studies, let's say, supported by the EuroLupus group in Europe. And the important thing is that we put together many centers working on lupus. There are now centers from all over Europe. There are more than 50 centers working in any of the projects that we are doing, several hundreds of people working together. We gather from time to time, every year or every 2 years, we do workshops, and we have also been able to do probably also the first Congress, the big Congress that was probably before this big international lupus congress organizing by Gladel. We organized the European Lupus Congress 2 years ago in Porto, mainly organized by the EuroLupus group and led by Carlos Vasconcelos. And let's start just to have some small figures of the work that we have done. And as I mentioned you before, we started with an epidemiological study that at that time we considered that it was the easier way to start, just putting data together. And we created the EuroLupus project in order to assess the morbidity and mortality of lupus patients in Europe. We gathered 1,000 European lupus patients, and we followed these patients in a prospective way during 10 years. And probably you are aware that we have what we call the EuroLupus medicine trilogy, because we published 3 papers in medicine. I can see that medicine probably is one of our preferred journals, because also Gladel published most of the epidemiological studies in medicine. The first one allows us to describe the patterns of disease expression, what we call now the lupus subsets, according to the age at onset, the gender, and the autoantibodies, which was something that already some people considered, but I think that after this big epidemiological study, it is clear that lupus is different according of the age of onset. The childhood onset is probably different than the elderly onset, and male lupus patients have some differences than female lupus patients. And I can see that also in Gladel have reproduced most of these studies. The second paper of the trilogy, after 5 years follow-up, allow us to differentiate the pattern of morbid mortality. We saw that disease activity, infections, and thrombosis were in similar percentages the main causes of morbid mortality in Europe. But I think that the most important thing of this prospective study was to analyze several immunological markers as factors of prognostic value, because we had the laboratory data at the beginning of the study when they enter into the study, and we follow prospectively for 5 years, and we were able to see what happened to these patients having or not having these autoantibodies. And certainly we confirmed, well, things like the antiphospholipid antibodies were clearly a factor of prognostic value for the development of thrombosis, recurrent abortions, and so on. And the same for other autoantibodies in a prospective way. And finally, the third big paper in Medicine Baltimore, after 10 years follow-up, we probably confirmed the Urovich bimodal mortality pattern, but also the clinical manifestations pattern or bimodal pattern. That is that most lupus inflammatory manifestations appear mainly at the beginning, but are less common after a long-term evolution of the disease. And by contrast, the thrombotic complications play a more prominent role both in morbidity and mortality after a long-term follow-up. This was the first big study, just epidemiological, just putting data into a computer and analyzing these data. But then we also performed soon after a big study that required to transfer some biological material from one center to another. That was the immunogenetics of lupus. It was at the beginning of the story of genetics. It was long before the GWAS and all these modern things. But we are still working on this, you will see at the end. But at this moment, also, it was very important because it was also the beginning of the European Union. And it was, I think, the first time that the European Union created a big grant similar to the grants that they have in Americas, in the NIH and so on. And we managed to get one of these big grants, the Biomed grant. And this allows us to characterize with the HLA typing that we had at the time, something like an HLA map of lupus. We published a lot of papers on this. Probably now they look old-fashioned, and we managed to find many associations. I want like Luis said before, I am not going to go in depth on the different associations, but there certainly we collected at the time more than 1,500 samples of different patients, and we managed to do really a good immunogenetic study. And then we did the third step, that it's not just to collect data, to collect samples, but also to do therapies, to do a clinical trial, interventional studies in our patients. And then we designed what is now called the EuroLupus nephritis trial. Just before Fred Usiu presented the data of this study, you know that it's the treatment of proliferative lupus nephritis compared the two intravenous cyclophosphamide regimes, the NIH high-dose cyclophosphamide versus the low-dose, let's say, EuroLupus regime, or also called xanthomacin regime or Graham-Hill regime. And also we have done a trilogy of papers. We like the trilogies. And you are well aware that the first study confirmed that certainly both regimes, low dose and high dose, were similar in efficacy. They both decreased creatinine, they both decreased 24 hours proteinuria, they both decreased activity. The dose of prednisone also decreased in a similar way, but with the advantage that those with a low dose had less side effects, mainly less infections, less amenorrhea. But some people said, well, this is just at the beginning, this is just in short term, maybe after long term, those who receive less dose of cyclophosphamide will have more rebounds, will have more flares. Well, we follow these patients, and after 5 years, we published the second paper of the trilogy of the EuroLupus nephritis trial, and this was not true. Both arms had similar efficacy after 5 years. And also, this allows us to know something that now we are also, again, very proud. It's on the recommendations, both in the ACR and in the EULAR recommendation. Just in the previous session, Professor Bebrahant stressed that we now know that after 6 months, we are able to know which patients probably will go well and which not, according to the data of this yellow lupus nephritis trial. And finally, we continue following our patients in an observational way. After 10 years, we can say that still the efficacy is similar in both arms after 10 years, which is also good news. And we continue doing these interventional studies, these trials, thanks mainly to Fred Ucio. I have to thank really the efforts that Fred Ucio has done during all these years to run these investigator-led trials. And in this case, what we wanted was to compare for the maintenance period. Another important thing I think that we have done in these yellow lupus trials is to enter, to include in our mind the concept of the sequential regime for the treatment of lupus nephritis. At the beginning, an intensive treatment for the induction of response, and then followed by a less aggressive therapy for the maintenance of the response, something that oncologists, our colleagues, oncologists, are doing always, or the majority of the occasions for cancer, for malignancies. We started this doing for lupus, and now is also done for other autoimmune diseases. Well, in this maintained nephritis trial, we wanted to compare for the maintenance, for the second period of the treatment, the efficacy of mycophenolate mofetil versus azathioprine. And then we designed the maintained nephritis trial. We gave as induction therapy to both arms the low dose, the yellow lupus, cyclophosphamide regime, and then we randomized half of the patients to azathioprine, the other half to mycophenolate. And you probably are aware of the data that also was presented before, that we found that in our European population, mainly white Caucasian, both regimes, mycophenolate and azathioprine, are similar in efficacy. The number of failures were similar, 19% versus 25%. Then other studies in other parts of the world, for instance, the ARM study, has found slightly different data. Even they found difference in the statistically significant difference in the response to MMF and azathioprine. And maybe this is the importance of doing the studies in different racial groups in different parts of the world. We really believe that for Europe, for the white Caucasians, it's similar in efficacy, mycophenolate and azathioprine. And just recently, we have finished another study, the cost of lupus. I am really very happy to see that you in Latin America, you want to do a similar study. We are following probably the same steps. We have done just recently, and it has just been published, I think it's still online, not on the papers in the Annals of Rheumatic Diseases, the cost of management of lupus, the annual direct medical cost of active lupus, that you can see that it's around 4,000 euros. It depends. In some countries probably is a little bit less, some little bit more. And in some countries this is mainly due to the cost of the drugs, of the medical treatment. In other countries probably is mainly due to other costs, the hospitalization, for instance. But we are still doing many projects. There are several, let's say, small projects that I have not mentioned, but these were the biggest projects that included several dozens of centers in some of them. Now we are running 3 big projects that I just want to mention. We are still working on clinical trials, and as this morning also was presented by Fred Ucio and Liz Lyston, we are now going to try to assess the effects of rituximab in refractory lupus nephritis. That's something I would like to stress also. Now we are very happy that drug companies are investing a lot in new drugs, in new biological therapies for lupus, and they are doing a lot of trials, which is really very good. But there are still some trials that I am sure that drug companies will never perform. Some drug companies are probably not interested anymore in some drugs that we physicians are very interested. So we have to push in order to do these studies. And the RING is one of these trials that I'm sure that it's essential to do this trial, and the drug companies will not do. And let's see if we manage to do, which is really important. Fred Ucio is leading this. I am sure that we are going to succeed. And then we are now also doing big genetic with the new GWAS and so on, like the Latin American group, and we call this the BioLupus, and it's Marta Larcón Riquelme is leading these studies. And we are also trying to do, in collaboration with the European Bone Marrow Transplantation Group, trials on bone marrow transplantation, on stem cell hematopoietic cells transplantations in patients with lupus. The ASTIL trial, led by one of the most important experts in Europe of bone marrow transplantation, which is Dominique Farge-Vancel. Well, you can see that there are a lot of work that has been done, we are doing. We hope to continue in the future. You are welcome to visit our work. It's open to your visit through the official website of the EuroLupus group. And you can just check through internet this data, this information. I have to tell you that we have done a slight evolution of the EuroLupus group, and we have just recently gathered with the more, let's say, official structure of the EULAR. There is a EULAR task force on lupus. We have probably merging what we call the EuroLupus 2.0, and we hope that in the future this will allow us to have even much more information on lupus in Europe. Thank you very much for your attention.